One thing that I always find fascinating about geopolitics and international relations is that at one moment you have this big crisis playing out on TV that everyone is talking about, when everyone becomes a geopolitics expert on Twitter. In the next moment, it's gone. No one cares, and it feels like it never happened. And that's exactly the case with the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, where the minute things calmed down, the attention moved on, and you basically don't hear about it ever since. But for me, when the mainstream media lose interest, that's when the really interesting part actually starts. Trying to understand what was it actually about? What were the consequences and what has changed? Why did it even matter and what does it mean for what's going to happen next? And because I feel like we've kind of skipped this with the Iran Israel war, I wanted to reflect on it and try to understand what was, if anything, actually achieved. If anyone can really claim victory, if anyone's goals were really fulfilled, or what is probably going to happen next. And probably the best way to get into it is to start by talking about the two big things that we actually still know very little about, and that are pretty crucial for understanding and assessing the whole war. First, we don't actually know how close was Iran to getting a nuclear bomb before the war started. To bring us back, that was the original declared argument with which Israel attacked Iran in the first place. They claimed that after many years, Iran has now gotten extremely close to finally acquiring a nuclear weapon, and that was the reason why they had to step in, to prevent Iran from getting it at the last minute, and stop it from using it to annihilate Israel. But there are some issues with those statements. Sure, Iran was most likely developing a nuclear weapon. They never admitted it, but there's a lot of indications that their nuclear program is most likely not just peaceful. They have most likely been developing a nuclear weapon for a few decades, and they're probably pretty close to being able to complete it and weaponize it. If they really wanted to, they could probably turn it into a functional nuclear weapon relatively quickly. But the key thing here is that they have been very close to completing it for well over a decade. Netanyahu argued that Iran was just months away from getting a bomb, but the US intelligence and officials have actually been claiming that Iran has been months away from getting a bomb for many years. And the key distinction is between having the ability to take the final step and turn it into a weapon and actually making the decision to do it. And while so far Iran has always had the option to make the final step and finish it, it has never made the decision, and it has been intentionally waiting just before the finish line. And why? Well, because it knew that if it did, it would probably have to deal with some pretty harsh consequences, like in the form of getting bombed. And so instead, it always stayed one step away from crossing the red line and used the possibility of getting a nuclear bomb as political leverage to try to get concessions from the United States and from the West in general, sometimes with more and sometimes with less success. And the thing is that while Israel has been claiming that Iran has made that decision, the messaging from the US on this has been a lot less clear. Theoretically, I think it is possible that Iran has actually taken that decision, but if that was the case, and the United States had absolutely solid intelligence about it, then I think they would have been a lot less hesitant to attack Iran than they were in reality. The other possibility is that Israel was not really telling the truth, and that while they might have seen that Iran is continuing with the nuclear enrichment program, it didn't necessarily mean that they were actually going to have the bomb next month, that they really made the decision. And it's possible that Israel's real motivation was a little different, either to just attack the Iranian nuclear program preemptively, or to continue their stream of attacks on Iranian proxies and dismantling the Iranian network, progressively making Iran weaker and weaker with a coup de grace to give Iran another blow. Or maybe they were trying to overthrow the regime, or all of those things together. But we don't really know whether that was really the motivation, how close Iran was to actually acquiring a nuclear weapon, and how imminent that moment was, if it was even a possibility. We also don't know, and that creates an additional problem for assessing the war, How badly was the Iranian program actually damaged? The US is kind of claiming that it was completely destroyed and that they sent it back to zero by destroying the facility for enriching uranium in Fordo, the underground base that the US B-52 bombers bombed with bunker-busting bombs, which is a mouthful of a sentence to say. But whether that's true, we also just simply don't know. My best guess would be that the Iranian nuclear program, and with it the ability to weaponize it, has been seriously damaged. If nothing else, then because Israel has killed a lot of Iran's top nuclear scientists. But it was probably not destroyed. And if Iran really wanted to, it could probably rebuild it again and be again in the position to acquire the nuclear weapon if they wanted to. But honestly, we don't have much more than speculation. So that's all of the things that we don't know. And here's what we do know. We do know that most likely American and Israeli goals in the war, even though the details are not really clear, were likely quite different. For America, the focus was much more narrow, a lot more focused on actually preventing Iran from getting a nuclear bomb, or at least making it a lot harder, regardless if Iran was actually moments away or if it was still in the same spot as all those years before. But for Israel, the goal was likely much broader. For them, damaging Iran's nuclear program was important, but likely it was an all-front assault on the Iranian state and regime. They were trying to make it weaker. That's why they were attacking Iranian oil and gas facilities, for example. And they were also trying to create conditions that would be conducive for facilitating a regime change. I don't think that Israelis thought that they would be able to do it on their own, but they were clearly trying to help start a spark. And that's why they were also targeting police and state security officials and the state broadcasting station. Donald Trump, on the other hand, specifically said that he's not pursuing a regime change in Iran. And although he actually said the opposite later on as well, I actually believe his first statement. I think that Trump wants to keep Iran down, but not break it down completely. Both because I don't think that he's someone who's a fan of regime changes in general, and because it would not look good and it could potentially create a lot of other issues for Trump and his administration as well. After all, the US has already a long history of regimes that it has overthrown, both in Iran and in the wider region, and the results in the end, in the long term, were never really that beneficial for the US anyway. Even if it was an option, and if it was successful, there's absolutely no guarantee that one regime wouldn't be replaced by another potentially just as hostile to the US as the original one, or that the country wouldn't descend into chaos for which the US would be likely seen as responsible for. Pursuing a regime change anywhere is a very risky gamble, and I think that if Donald Trump really doesn't want something, then it's getting the United States involved in another Middle Eastern revolution that it would be very hard to get out of. On the other hand, Netanyahu's perspective is probably completely different, and Israel would be quite likely pretty happy to see a regime change no matter what happens afterwards. If Iran is already claiming that it wants to destroy Israel, it can't really get that much worse. And I'm not really talking here about the Iranian goals here, and that's because likely it didn't have any, as it wasn't their choice to start the war, and they were more of a passive player in this game. However, they do have a choice now, and a pretty big one, which is what brings us to the next part. Because the main question here is, was it actually worth it for Israel and for the United States to start or join in the war? Did they achieve what they originally wanted? And I would say that because they have had different goals, the answer might be actually different for each of them. For Israel, I would say that from their perspective, it's probably seen as a pretty successful operation. They didn't achieve anything completely. The regime is still standing, and their nuclear program is likely still salvageable. But they did leave Iran a lot weaker than before. They took out a lot of important people and sent a pretty strong message to everyone in Iran and to all their allies across the region that they can come in and basically do anything they want, which will likely make people think twice before joining or working with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Now, they didn't take down the regime, and ironically, they might have even made it stronger, at least temporarily, by giving it a chance to rally people around the flag against a common enemy, Israel. And predicting whether a regime would fall or not is always very tricky. I actually wrote a Substack on this very topic, why some regimes survive and why some fall, where I delve into it in more detail. It's free, and I will leave a link in the description if you want to read it. But if their goal was to overall make Iran less of a threat by weakening it across all fronts, then they probably were quite successful, or at least they probably see it that way. Now, ironically, for the United States, which has had a much more narrow goal, that's not so clear, because Iran now has a pretty big decision to make. Basically, what Iran and everyone else has seen and confirmed in the war is that conventionally, Iran has very few ways of defending itself against Israel. Israel was able to take out most of Iranian defenses at the very onset of the war and then dominate the airspace. And Iran was not really able to do that much to stop it. But what's worse for Iran is that everyone now knows that if they wanted, Israel could likely do the same thing again. And if Iran wants to prevent that, it basically has two options. First, it can try to massively boost its conventional capabilities, so that next time they would be able to stop Israel from doing the exact same thing, mostly by building up its air force and air defenses. But the problem with that is that this would be very expensive. It would take a long time, and it's not even clear if it would be even possible. Even if Iran would be able to buy some fighter jets and air defense from foreign suppliers in sufficient quantity, the quality likely wouldn't suffice to really match the quality like that of the 35s that Israel has. And so the other way for Iran is to try to achieve a deterrent through asymmetrical, unconventional means. And that would basically mean trying to get the nuclear weapon as soon as possible. Because while it is dangerous to try to get a nuclear weapon, once you actually have one that you're able to use and deploy, your safety quite radically increases. At least in theory, as states that do have nuclear weapons are attacked much less often than those without them. Just look at North Korea. And so paradoxically, there is a chance that the US and Israeli attack could motivate Iran to finally cross the red line and try to weaponize its nuclear program. Although whether it would actually do it, and whether it wouldn't result in another series of strikes, this time even more destructive, is another issue. Either way, however, the United States clearly hope that Iran is not going to take this route, and that instead it's going to accept defeat, rejoin the negotiations, and finally give up its nuclear program for good, in return for probably some sanctions relief. However, so far, that doesn't seem to be happening at all. Instead, Iran is signaling that giving up its nuclear program is not an option, and it has no intention of seriously negotiating if that is the prime condition. Finally, though, there also is a third option, which might be actually the most likely one, and that's that Iran will do neither of those two things, nor escalate or de-escalate. That it will refuse to give up its nuclear program, but it won't actually move to get a nuclear weapon either, and that it will be basically doing the same thing that it has been doing up until now. It wouldn't be a move that could improve its position, but it also wouldn't be a major gamble. It would basically be a strategy of sitting still and doing nothing, which so far is how the Iranian regime often reacts. Wait, do the same thing, and see what happens. What happens with Trump that actually has a constituency that's not very happy about starting new wars? What happens with Netanyahu that faces elections next year? And what happens at home in Iran? How will everything that happens play out both among the public and the regime elites? And for all of that, we'll have to wait and see.